Myriam Bienenstock is emeritus professor at the University of Tours. She dedicated her research to the practical philosophy of German idealism, more particularly Hegel, and to the Jewish thought of 19th and 20th centuries, publishing mainly on Hermann Cohen, Franz Rosenzweig, and Emmanuel Levinas. The title of her today's talk is Transcendental versus Aesthetical Pantheism, Hegel's Way towards Spinozism. Professor Bienenstock, you have the floor.
I take the liberty of presenting a highly classical introduction. It may be outdated or not fashionable. Actually, I call it a vintage presentation of the pantheism and Hegel on the pantheism. But I do hope that it will nevertheless be useful. I have already worked a lot on the subject of this conference, and like many of the colleagues who are here today, but I think that what has been done is far from exhausting the many questions that remain open, and I shall try to focus upon some of them. There were in Hegel's times many different ways or routes towards Spinoza, as I have called them in a recent article on the subject. 3 of them are particularly relevant to discuss Hegel's own route towards Spinoza. The first one is Mendelssohn's, the route of the German Enlightenment, the Aufklärung. We know that Hegel took stand for Spinoza after having read Jacobi's letters. But in these letters, Spinoza was represented by Lessing and by Mendelssohn, an author whom Hegel has read and studied very early on. Surprisingly enough, though, thank you, an adequate investigation of Hegel's attitude to Mendelssohn remains, up to this day, a real desideratum of research. That which is at stake in Hegel's reading of Mendelssohn, before and then after he had read Jacobi's letters on Spinoza, is not just his attitude on Spinoza, but also the important and related question of his stand on the Aufklärung, the German Enlightenment, that is, on the basic question of religious tolerance. On the Aufklärung, Jacobi's own position had been unambiguously clear, although not unambiguous on Spinoza himself. But it had not been Spinoza whom Jacobi had targeted. Spinoza had long been dead, and Jacobi targeted living adversaries, amongst them, first and foremost, the main representative of the Berlin Aufklärung, Moses Mendelssohn. This had been so obvious that many already at the time judged that Jacobi had killed Mendelssohn, perhaps not personally and literally, but in any case, figuratively. From this it was inferred that his publication marked the twilight, perhaps even the end of the Enlightenment as such. The claim has survived up to the present day. Many indeed do say that the philosophy of the Enlightenment is not alive anymore today. I'm not convinced. Let me take the liberty of expressing the hope that the philosophy of the Enlightenment is still alive in many forms. But it is up to you and many others to say if this hope is outdated or not. It is, in any case, undeniable that the success of Jacobi's publication was momentous. It was so great that it did stall the momentum towards the Enlightenment as a whole. Coming back to the reception of Mendelssohn, that main representative of the German Enlightenment, it would certainly not be exaggerated to say, and this is another point I would like to make here, that Mendelssohn, who prior to 1785 had been considered as one of the greatest living German philosophers, began to be perceived after the publication of Jacobi's letters mainly as a Jew who had understood neither Spinoza nor his friend Lessing. One seems to have wholly forgotten that it was Mendelssohn who had served as a living model for Nathan in Lessing's piece on behalf of religious tolerance, Nathan der Weise, so that it was nothing less than the fight for religious tolerance, that essential impulse of the Enlightenment in Germany and also in other countries, which thereby collapsed. Amongst the many perspicuous remarks Jacobi makes in his letters, there is one which he actually puts in Mendelssohn's mouth, and which I find very relevant to our queries, according to which Mendelssohn, when he heard for the first time that Lessing had held Spinoza's system to be true, asked which system of Spinoza it was, which was meant. The one expounded in the Tractatus, that of the Principia Philosophia Cartesiana, or the one which was presented posthumously in the Ethics. It is quite amazing, I think, to discover that there is, again, almost a research gap on Hegel's reception of Spinoza's Tractatus. But I do not want to be too provocative, and I shall be somehow more prudent. I'm not saying that nothing has been done on that topic, but only that very little has been achieved. And this is even truer when one compared the number of studies devoted to that question, the question of Hegel's reception of the Tractatus, which ought to have been a central one for Hegel scholars, to the number of studies of pantheism, on pantheism. Still, I have already written and published on these questions, and I shall not focus upon them here, also because Giacomo Petrarca, who will speak directly after me, seems to want to address that. I leave that to him with great pleasure and expectation. Which system of Spinoza is it then, which we mean when we meditate over Hegel and his reception of Spinoza? Those who take account of the Principia also want to discuss Spinoza's relation to Descartes, but we mostly assume that it is the system presented in the Ethics which is meant. The route which is most popular up to this day is the Promethean transcendental one endorsed by Fichte and many authors linked to the German early Romanticism. And maybe it is no accident that this conference also hints at it by choosing as a title substance and subject. This, however, could well be the very route which was criticized by Herder under the appellation Transcendental Spinozism. Since 1787, the year in which these conversations were first published, Herder writes, in the preface to the second edition of his God, Some Conversations, and I quote, "A great deal has changed on the philosophical horizon in Germany. Spinoza's name, which before that time was usually mentioned with horror and loathing, thereafter rose so high in the estimation of some that they could not speak of him save at the expense of Leibniz and of other excellent spirits. Indeed, his system was so misused that, forgetting all the limits of human knowledge, which Spinoza recognized so well, some turned things upside down and made bold to spin out the contents of the entire universe from a confined and imaginary ego. This senseless dream was called Transcendental Spinozism, and the old Spinoza was derided because he had not gone so far. Things have not changed much since that time, and it is surprising. For it cannot be doubted that Herder played a major pioneering role in the reception of Spinoza in Germany. But this is not properly acknowledged up to this day. This is particularly true with regard to Hegel. For Hegel seems to have read Herder very early on and extensively. He even wrote a review of Herder's God, in which he detailed the differences between the two editions of the God, but that review seems to have been lost. His way of proceeding in his article of 1802, entitled Faith and Knowledge, is particularly striking. It is to Jacobi that he devotes the greatest number of pages, many more indeed than to Kant and to Fichte. And what is even more striking is his lack of attention for Herder. He gets rid of him in one page, going as far as writing that Herder's way of doing philosophy is only a slight modification of the philosophizing pattern one finds in Jacobi. He puts Kant, Jacobi, and Herder together, and he vehemently rejects their way of practicing philosophy, that Reflexionsphilosophie der Subjektivität he finds in Kant, Jacobi, and also Herder. Isn't that too quick? One may rightly wonder, also with Frau Sandkaulen today, about his relative silence, for he rarely quotes Herder explicitly, also in his later mature writings. The position I shall advocate here is that the kind of transcendental Spinozism deprecated by Herder in the second edition of his God may account for some forms of early Romanticism and for a Hegelian appropriation of Spinoza based upon some of his early texts, but certainly not for his mature appropriation of Spinoza, the one we find in his encyclopedia, which is much closer to that to which I have referred as an aesthetic Spinozism. This is only a provisory denomination, though, but for the question then is, of course, to understand what one means by aesthetics, and I understand now that there will be another Tagung on precisely on that subject. I will first have to get hold of the old edition of Herder's God. Hegel writes in a letter dated 26 August 1801, so that I can give account of the new edition. It is at least clear to me that he left out what Jacobi discusses in the letters. Had he truly grasped this, he would have had to leave everything out. What is it then that Jacobi discussed in his letters? What was that question which had been left out by Herder? The fact that at the same time, in 1802, Hegel ascribed much importance to characterizing the concept of Kraft, or force, a concept he believed to have been fundamental for Herder, led many to suppose that this must have been the point mistakenly left aside by Herder. It is true, Hegel writes, that Herder does not go as far as replacing rational thought with feeling, or with the subjectivity of an instinct, as Jacobi would do. He rather replaces it with the notion that he sees as the center of the Spinozist system, that of force, or original force, Urkraft. In this sense, his way of philosophizing would be a little more objective than Jacobi's. But, Hegel adds, the concept of Kraft is merely a concept of reflection, something in which the rational is also veiled, and which Herder has no intention, any more than Jacobi had, of unveiling, enthüllen, for philosophical knowledge. For reason, Herder would also explicitly claim that he has no intention of explaining what he meant by force. Herder, Hegel writes in Faith and Knowledge, and Hegel quotes him at length, Herder is fully conscious of what he's doing when he expounds the central thesis of the Spinozistic system with the first organic force, One signifies at the same time the inner and outer, the spiritual and the corporeal, but it is still only an expression, for we do not understand what force is, nor do we claim to have explained the word body by it. This is exactly Jacobi's concern, to replace philosophical ideas with expressions and words which are not supposed to give knowledge or understanding. These words and expressions may well have a philosophical meaning, but Jacobi's polemic is directed precisely against the philosophies which take them seriously and make their philosophical meaning articulate. Those commentators who want to account for Hegel's criticism of Herder by singling out his criticism of the concept of Kraft also refer to the importance Hegel ascribed to that notion until the end of his life, and to what he says in his 1830 Encyclopedia's Logic. He says there that construing God as force is, I quote, a confusion from which Herder's God suffers especially. And what he then valorizes is the difference between the notion of force, Kraft, and that of purpose, or Zweck. But at Jena, and more particularly in Faith and Knowledge, Hegel did not yet resort to the notion of Zweck, or more generally to teleology. His positive appreciation of Spinozism rather led him to carefully avoid such an approach. This means that he cannot possibly have wanted in those years to criticize Herder for not having resorted to the concept of Zweck and for not having grasped the difference between Zweck and Kraft. The reproach he formulates against Herder is a much more fundamental one. He writes that both our authors, namely Jacobi and Herder, share the effort to abolish the scientific form of rational cognition wherever it is present. Herder would have abandoned from the start any and every attempt to grasp what a force is, and thereby rallied Jacobi's vindication of faith. Hegel brings Herder back to Jacobi, and it is first and foremost Jacobi's philosophizing practice that he unilaterally rejects. That cannot be doubted. However, his starting point in reading Herder is Jacobi's viewpoint, Jacobi's perspective in the letters, a perspective that he himself condemns. He condemns Herder because he assimilates his viewpoint to Jacobi's, which he condemns. But is it right to assimilate Herder's position to Jacobi's? For Hegel, in any case at that time, it is clearly Jacobi who determines what is at stake in the debate on Spinozism. It is Jacobi who formulates the questions that contemporaries must answer in philosophy. And Hegel seems to believe, in any case at that time, that if Herder does not answer these questions of Jacobi, he has nothing more to say. For if we are to believe Hegel in Faith and Knowledge, Herder did accept Jacobi's opposition between knowledge and faith. He would have recognized that science, or to say this more properly, philosophical science, must be abandoned in favor of faith, Glaube. The conclusion then being that we must take the perilous leap, the salto mortale, into faith. This was Jacobi's famous formulations in his letters. But Hegel does not only forcefully reject the conclusion, the need of a perilous leap, but also its presuppositions, the opposition between knowledge and faith. For him, in 1801, 1802, that is precisely at the time when he is elaborating his system of philosophy, what is essential is to elaborate the scientific form in which rational knowledge must be presented, and there can be no question of renouncing it in favor of faith. And if there is no question of that, this is because renouncing knowledge, rational knowledge, also means, obviously, renouncing freedom, and with freedom, all morality. Hadn't Spinoza's aim been to set himself free through knowledge, Herder would renounce this aim and thus lose the essence of the Spinozist system. This is why Hegel claims that had he truly grasped this, he would have had to leave everything out. What Hegel is looking for in Herder, then, is an answer to questions that were Jacobi's questions, but perhaps not those of Herder himself. And it is because he does not find a satisfactory answer to these questions of Jacobi in Herder's writings that he rejects Herder out of hand, without acknowledging that in many other respects he is still Herder's disciple. Perhaps this is why he finds it difficult to recognize what he really owes to Herder. Perhaps this is also why even today it is difficult for us to recognize the debt he owes to Herder. We also read Herder quite often whilst having in mind other authors, Jacobi's letters, and of course Kant's ferocious criticism. For us to understand and correctly appreciate Hegel's judgment of Herder in Faith and Knowledge, we must, however, keep in mind the huge difference between Herder's appreciation of Spinoza and Jacobi's. Herder, this should be strongly emphasized, never accepted, he most probably never really understood the opposition Jacobi had introduced between faith and knowledge, and the necessity to perform a leap into that which was called by Jacobi Glaube, faith. If it is not necessary to perform a salto mortale, why does one need to perform it? Wenn man keinen Salto mortale zu tun nötig hat, warum braucht man ihn zu tun? And surely we may, that is, need not do that, because in the creation we are on level ground. Und gewiss, that's my translation, it's a bit difficult, wir dürfen es, das heißt, brauchen es nicht, denn wir sind in der Schöpfung auf ebenem Boden. This is what Herder writes to Jacobi in a letter dated February 6, 1784, which is of paramount importance for understanding the pantheism controversy and Hegel's reaction to it. Here is one of the key passages. The proton pseudos error in premise in your system and that of all the anti-Spinozists, dear Jacobi, is that God, as the great entium who is in all phenomena the eternally acting cause of its being, would be a zero, an abstract concept like the one we formulate for us. But this is not what it is according to Spinoza. It, God, rather is the most real, most active one, the only one saying to itself, I am that I am, and shall be that I shall be. It is not from the negation of the proposition ex nihilo nihil fit, but from the eternal proposition quidquid est, illud est, whatever is, it is, that the philosophy of the true entity begins. It is precisely that concept of being which Spinoza developed in such a fertile way, and it is rightfully, in my opinion, that he put it above all the modes of representation and thinking of singular phenomena, as well as above limited modes of existence in space. What Herder says here is that Jacobi's conception of Spinoza is an utterly reactive one, one which reacts to Spinoza's most basic affirmation, the affirmation of God's being, by negating it. The main reason for which it misrepresents or distorts Spinoza's thought is that it does not begin with being as such, with the concept of Sein, but with abstract concepts, concepts we are the ones to concoct. It begins with the knowing subject. What we should learn from Spinoza is that one must set at the center of our philosophical reflection the concept of Sein, being or Dasein, existence, not the knowing subject and his representation, Ich or the ego. And Hegel repeats this, Herder, will repeat this in his God at the beginning of the fourth conversation in which he discusses Jacobi. Spinoza, he says, there adopts being, Sein, also Dasein, and not the I or consciousness as his point of departure. This will also be Hegel's point of departure in the Science of Logic of the Encyclopedia. It is important to realize that Herder's interest in Spinoza predated Jacobi's. Herder seems to have studied the ethics, parts 2 and 4, during the years 71-76, and at the same time, with much attention, the Tractatus. But he had laid the foundations of his conception long before he read Spinoza, and long before the years of the Pantheism controversy, perhaps already in 1762, 1764, as he was following Kant's lectures in Königsberg. Listening to these lectures certainly was one of the most powerful experiences in Herder's life. But if we want to correctly understand their impact on him, we must keep in mind that Kant in those years had not yet performed that which is known as his critical turn. He was preparing works like the attempt to introduce the concept of negative magnitudes into philosophy, or the only possible argument in support of a demonstration of the existence of God. Echoes of these works may be found in writings of Herder, which were composed in those years, more particularly in a fascinating fragment on being, dated 1764. The fragment was published for the first time in 1936, but the great historian of philosophy, Wilhelm Dilthey, whom we all know here, if only because of his works on Hegel, had already given a commentary of it in 1894, without, however, having read and known the text itself. He seems to have relied upon a commentary offered by another 19th century Hegel specialist, Rudolf Heim, in his work on Herder. Dilthey's commentary then became nevertheless a landmark, not just for the scholarship on Herder, but also for the Hegel scholarship. Dilthey, who thereby also relied upon Rudolf Heim's commentary, had written that when Herder listened to Kant's teaching in 1762, 1764, when he heard that the philosophical analysis is ultimately confronted with concepts that are unanalyzable, unanalysierbar, like those of Dasein, existence, space and time, but also Kraft, force, he felt much strengthened in an aesthetical approach or perspective to the universe. But when we today look at Herder's text itself, we reach the conclusion that Herder learned from Kant, or believed he could learn many other lessons. Kant in 1762, 1764 did not yet reject the endeavor to demonstrate the existence of God. He rather set out to determine the true foundations such a demonstration might have. And to this end, he criticized some of its more traditional formulations, including Descartes' ontological proof. He distinguished between different meanings, different uses the term Dasein or the term Sein could have, more particularly between existence as the absolute positing of a thing and existence as a predicate, merely as the relation respectus logicus of something as a characteristic mark of a thing, the copula in a judgment. And this is exactly the distinction that Herder takes over in his fragment on being. He then distinguishes between being as a concept, Sein als ein Begriff, that is, he says, ein Realsein, a real being, and Sein als Glied eines Satzes, being as a component of a proposition. There are many philosophers, he writes, who do not distinguish between these senses. They want to infer the one from the other, to infer from the ideal being to the existential being. This would be what Descartes had done with his I think, therefore I am, and Crusius with his I'm conscious of myself, therefore I am. However, both are wrong. They are idealists, Herder says in the same fragment of being. Also, egoisten, in the literal sense of the term. And this is how Herder resorts to it. These egoists almost consider themselves as God. Göttlich zu sich sagen kann, ich denke durch mich und alles andere durch mich. Perhaps alone can say to itself in a divine manner, I think by way of myself and all else by way of myself, as if the world could be reconstructed without any a priori premise. Those whom Herder criticizes here are the philosophers, more precisely idealistic philosophers. Contrarily to what Dilthey had believed, he does not conclude that being as a concept is, just like other concepts like that of craft or those of space and time, a limit to our knowledge, an obscure and undemonstrable basis to it, and that philosophy itself thus has its limits. He does emphasize that the abstraction, the analysis, or the decomposition, Zergliederung of our representations cannot expand infinitely. All my representations are sensory, are obscure. Alle meine Vorstellungen sind sinnlich, sind dunkel, he says. Sinnlich und dunkel schon längst als gleichbedeutende Ausdrücke bewiesen. Sensory and unanalyzable are synonyms. Thus, the more sensory a concept, the more unanalyzable. And if there is one concept that is the most sensory, it will not be possible to analyze anything within it. This is the case with the concept of being, this little world, which is at the basis of all the others. Philosophers, Herder writes, will say that this little world, this concept also is completely uncertain. Aber sind nicht die sinnlichen Begriffe gewiss? But are the sensory concepts not certain? They are more certain than are all the others. But the certainty is objective, not subjective, as in the case of the philosophers, those idealists or egoists. What Herder takes over here is not only Kant's teaching at the time, but also that of Baumgarten, the author whose manuals Kant regularly followed in those years. The central issue for him is not to show that sinnlich, sensory, means unanalyzable, inscrutable rationally. He rather wants to show, on the contrary, that it is the sensory which must be raised to a science, to a specific form of knowledge. And I'm going to skip that. the concept of being, he says, there is the center of all certainty, since on the one hand, every sensory something, and on the other hand, every rational something is subordinate to it. For one, the highest degree of proof, quidquid est, illud est, borders on this concept. Thus, being is unanalyzable, unprovable, the center of all certainty. Hegel does not conclude here. Herder, I'm sorry, it's not yet. Herder, almost, but not yet. Herder does not conclude here, any more than Kant had done at the same time, that it is impossible to demonstrate the existence of God. It would be more accurate to formulate what he says differently. He contends that such a demonstration is unnecessary, that it is superfluous. This is also what he will say much later on in his God, and I quote, "The idea of God is essential to our thinking, so essential, indeed, that without it, without the conception of God, there would be no reason, much less a demonstration. For even if one does not take into consideration the source of the forces which think, act, and work, the tremendous number of which the transcendental philosopher, that is, one who overreaches himself, can never deny to be present in our world, yet the manner alone in which all these forces work according to their nature is for me proof enough of God, that is, of an essential ground of inner truth, harmony, goodness, and perfection, which includes its existence in itself. The fact that there is, for example, a truth that is something capable of being thought, and that what can be thought can be related according to inner laws, and that by means of innumerable relations of this kind, harmony and order are revealed, is to me in itself the profoundest proof of God, even were I an unhappy egoist or idealist who imagined himself to be the only thinking being in the world. Between every subject and predicate, there stands an is or is not, and this is this formula of equation and coincidence between different ideas. The mere sign equal is my proof of God. This is what Herder says in his God, a work whose first edition appeared in 1787, the second in 1800, and which may rightly count at the first book length, explicitly positive vindication of Spinoza in Germany. At its point of departure, one doesn't find the I or consciousness, but the concept of being, of Sein, also Dasein. The concept has been translated into English as existence, and one will not be surprised to hear that Herder has, for that reason, attracted the attention of some Heideggerians. I'm not so sure that this rapprochement, or even the comparison, will turn out to be fruitful, but it is certainly significant that Herder had begun to elaborate his basic ideas on God and on being long before he brought them back to Spinoza. For it only was in the 80s that he seems to have immersed himself in the study of Spinoza's metaphysics. At that time, he also convinced Goethe, whose declaration in a letter dated June 9, 1785, has remained famous. Spinoza, Goethe then wrote, does not demonstrate the existence of God. The existence is God, and if for that reason others scold him as an atheist, I would like to call him Deissimum and Christianissimum, and to praise him. Now, the road, yes, from these theses to Hegel is very short. It is, to be sure, Hölderlin, whom many Hegel scholars most often evoked when they endeavored to reconstruct Hegel's way. They pointed to discussions Hegel had with Hölderlin at the time of his stay in Frankfurt. And I'm alluding here mainly to Dieter Henrich, recently deceased in his Hegel in context. There is no reason to question the importance of the role played here by Hölderlin. It may well be him who was the first to develop the philosophical arguments one finds in Hegel. For example, in a fragment Hegel seems to have written in 1795 in Bern, Glauben ist die Art, union and being, etc., but I'm not going to quote that now, even if this is fundamental. It is Dieter Henrich would never have put in doubt the fact that Hegel's discussions with Hölderlin all have in their background Herder's writings, and naturally also the two editions of Herder's God. He himself wrote on that. Still, and this is my conclusion, Herder has a fairly bad reputation amongst philosophers, maybe, perhaps, mainly because of Kant, who had harshly criticized him for an alleged obscurantism, de l'obscurantisme, one which would be directly opposed to his own endeavor as a philosopher, and in other words, to the German Enlightenment movement, the Aufklärung. Let me come back to my conclusion, in my conclusion to my beginning. Herder is supposed to be a Schwärmer, an enthusiast. That term was used at the time by proponents of the Aufklärung as a libel, synonym of fanatic, in order to fight all those positions which did not seem to them compatible with their own convictions. And then Jacobi took over the term and turned it against his own opponents, Kant included. So, where do we stand on the Enlightenment? Not just with Herder and Hegel, also with ourselves. This could be one basic question of this conference. And I thank you for your...
Thank you, Professor Bienenstock, for this rich and detailed presentation. Now time for questions. So please, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Okay, I see Sanan.
Thanks a lot for this inspiring talk. Until I heard you, I was thinking only that Jacobi has been the one who started a kind of reaction against reason through the name of the God. But now, after your presentation, I have a question, because you mentioned that Herder was the first who just accused the philosophers as egoists. And if you think that a critique of the absence of God in the reason, in the Enlightenment, has become a point of reaction in the whole German tradition, can we make a triangle between like Herder, Jacobi, but also Heidegger? Because if you think, Heidegger never talked of God as God, but he talked then for criticizing the reason, I mean Hegel's reason, the forgetfulness of being. But would you say that there is a kind of connection which, through the name of God, or not articulated name of God, always keeps a kind of critique of reason, which interestingly not only has to be reactionary, because if you just think of Adorno, he used the same, like it becomes a point of resistance against concept. Like this God remains as a ghost in the concept and gives a reaction to be conceptualized. That will be my question, if you could see a kind of triangle between Herder, Jacobi, and Heidegger.
Well, yes, I thought the mention of Heidegger would raise questions or interest, but I'm not a specialist of Heidegger, actually. So I'm not so sure. It's and I'm not so sure that the relation is that fruitful as a reaction to understand a reaction to actually a kind of subjective idealism, if that's what it is. There was a reaction to a certain kind of subjective idealism in Herder, but I'm not so sure that one can relate it so simply, and in Hegel actually, but I'm not so sure one can relate it to directly to Heidegger. I'm not so sure I understood your question properly. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, like that. By the way, for those who are watching the YouTube stream, you can pose a question, and it will be time it will be answered.
Thank you very much, Myriam. It was extremely rich and interesting. Just a quick point about the point you made at the beginning, saying that there is not so much responses to Mendelssohn in Hegel, or at least not so much discussion. I suspect there is one place where Hegel is referring to Mendelssohn in the context of Spinoza, but not so positively. And if you remember the passage in the lectures on the history of philosophy, where Hegel is referring to the three systems of theology, acosmism, Spinozism, against atheism, and then there is the middle position. The middle position is saying both God exists and finite things exist. I think that's the Mendelssohnian Leibnizian position. Hegel thinks it's popular. He criticized that, but my suspicion is that that's precise. This similar criticism, I think, he's basically taking from Maimon, but that's the point.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think there is compared to the influence Mendelssohn and the reading of Mendelssohn had on Hegel, I think very little has been done, actually. Of course, Hegel says that Hegel relates to Mendelssohn sometimes, but somehow not as much as what one would have expected him to, considering the fact that he seems to have read him a long time before he read Jacobi, actually, and Spinoza. Mendelssohn was one of the first authors he cultivated and read, and not just the Jerusalem, but also other books. And there were certain authors who said that some of his basic concepts, Hegel's basic concepts, are indebted actually to Mendelssohn. That has not been properly studied, I think. But what strikes me most is the fact that Hegel very certainly read Mendelssohn's Jerusalem, and that Mendelssohn is one work which had been written especially to further religious tolerance. And Hegel doesn't say that. And Hegel seems not to see that at all. And this is one of the points, I think, which you deserve further inquiry. Why doesn't Hegel see that in Mendelssohn, and further on, of course, what is Hegel's position on religious tolerance. So yes, of course, there are, you just quoted one point, there are certain places where Hegel quotes Mendelssohn, but I think this doesn't do justice to the influence of Mendelssohn on his thought.
Okay, Professor Zantal.
So, thank you very much for your talk. I have 2 points. The second point I will more speak about tomorrow morning in my talk. I think it's a misunderstanding by Herder to think that Jacobi has informed about abstract concepts in Spinoza. Just the opposite. Jacobi says in a letter to Herder, I have talked about Sein in allem Dasein. That's very, very important, and that's the source also for Hegel. I will talk about this tomorrow. First point, I think it's very, very important to leave this old story of Jacobi as the enemy of the Enlightenment. He has a discussion with Berliner Aufklärung, that's right, but he is no enemy of Enlightenment in general. We should discuss about Enlightenment. What is Enlightenment? What is freedom? What is rationality? What is reason? And we have Jacobi on our side. That's very, very important, and I would be very thankful if we leave down this old story of Jacobi as enemy of Enlightenment. I can't hear it anymore, I must say. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for those remarks. About the first one, what was important to me was to emphasize, because I think that it is a very important point, that Herder came first in his somehow valorization of Spinoza. And he was the first to write on Spinoza, and Jacobi reacted to, I mean, the acceptance of Spinoza, which was beginning to be too much for him in Germany. So Jacobi should be seen as a reaction, not as an initial, introduction of Spinoza in Germany. Spinoza had so much success already, also in Herder, that Jacobi had to react. Now, how do you want to see this reaction? Whether I know that Jacobi was in his first writings was somehow also an Aufklärer, and he thought he could rally those two Weimar authors, Herder and Goethe, to his cause. He thought he would find in them allies. And so of course there is much in Jacobi which may lead us to think that he was a friend of the Enlightenment. Well, with regard to Mendelssohn, I'm not so sure that he was so friendly to him ever. And now, of course, the question is how you understand the Enlightenment, particularly the German one, and there are so many definitions of that it's impossible to get into it now, but there was an antagonism somehow. Yeah, German one, Aufklärung, yeah, and poor Mendelssohn.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, very, very good.
I love Herder very much, of course. Only want to add both of them. both of them starts with Kant's Beweisgrund in the 60s, both of them. And there we get Sein from Kant. Only this.
Yeah.
Also Jacobi in the 60s.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Time for some